Independence and the Firestorm begins June 30th, 1960, Leopoldville, the capital of the newly independent Congo. The sun hung high over the boulevard as brass bands blared and flags fluttered in the heat. Thousands of Congolese filled the streets, pressed shoulder to shoulder, shouting, crying, waving the new blue flag with its golden star. For the first time in their lives, they were free. At the front of the crowd stood Patrice Lumumba, the new prime minister, tall, sharp-featured, with a piercing gaze that could cut through a man's soul. He had spent the morning in the marble hall of the Palais de la Nation beside King Baudouin of Belgium. Cameras flashed. The Belgian monarch had just declared that independence was a gift of civilization, a remark that made Lumumba's blood boil. When Lumumba took the podium, the room fell silent. His voice trembled at first, then sharpened with anger. He spoke of slavery, of chains, of men beaten for daring to walk on sidewalks meant for whites. He said independence was not a gift, it was won through struggle and blood. The Belgian dignitary stared in shock, but the crowd outside erupted. They heard in his words the sound of a new Congo being born. Yet beneath the celebration, the country was a powder keg. The Belgian flag might have come down, but the Belgian officers still commanded the army. The mines, the real treasure of Congo, were still controlled by foreign hands. The CIA had their eyes on the uranium mines in Katanga. The Soviets had begun whispering to Lumumba's ministers. Within days, the thin fabric of peace tore apart. The force publique, Congo's national army, mutinied. The black soldiers turned on their white officers. Belgian families fled by the thousands, loading trucks with furniture and gold, racing to the airports. In the streets of Leopoldville, mobs looted stores and stormed colonial homes. Soldiers fired into the air, smoke rose from burning villas. Lumumba, exhausted and furious, took to the radio. "The days of humiliation are over," he declared. "The army belongs to the Congolese now," but his words only deepened the fear in Brussels and in Washington. Belgium sent in troops, claiming they were protecting their citizens. Planes landed in Katanga, a province rich in copper and uranium, and Belgian officers helped install Mobutu, a soft-spoken businessman who declared Katanga's independence from Congo. Suddenly, the heart of Africa was fracturing. Lumumba turned to the United Nations, begging for help. Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld sent blue-helmeted peacekeepers, but they had orders not to interfere in Katanga. The United Nations was neutral, a word that meant nothing to a man whose country was bleeding. When the UN refused to act, Lumumba made a desperate choice. He turned to the Soviet Union. Moscow responded fast. Antonov cargo planes landed in Leopoldville, unloading weapons, trucks, and advisors. To the CIA, that was the nightmare scenario, a pro-Soviet government in the center of Africa, sitting on the minerals that fueled the atomic age. In Washington, President Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. The room was filled with maps, red lines, and grim faces. The decision was swift. Lumumba had to go. In the coming weeks, the Congo would become a chessboard for the Cold War. Spies, mercenaries, and politicians would move their pieces. But the game would cost lives, and the first to pay would be the man who had dared to speak the truth on Independence Day. The CIA moves in August 1960, Leopoldville. The humidity hung thick over the Congo River as the city sank into chaos. Radio stations crackled with rumors. Soldiers patrolled the streets in stolen jeeps. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire echoed, the sound of a country devouring itself. Inside a small bungalow near the American embassy, a man named Larry Devlin, the CIA's chief of station, sat at a wooden table littered with cables, maps, and coffee cups. He was tall, composed, and carried himself like a man who had seen worse. His orders had come directly from Washington. Eliminate Lumumba. The memo was cold, bureaucratic, removed from active politics, but everyone knew what it meant. Devlin had already begun his work. He was cultivating allies within the Congolese army, whispering promises of money and power. One of them, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, was young, ambitious, and patient. He had been Lumumba's protege once, but now he was watching his mentor fall apart. Lumumba, meanwhile, was running out of friends. His alliance with the Soviets had turned the West against him, and the UN peacekeepers ignored his calls for action. Each night, he paced his office, chain-smoking, his voice rising in anger as he dictated letters. His ministers were deserting him one by one. Belgian officers plotted from Elizabethville, advising Chim's Katongan regime. White mercenaries, ex-soldiers from Europe and South Africa, began pouring into the province, fighting under Katonga's flag for a handsome fee. In the bars of Leopoldville, you could hear them bragging about the pay. "It's not a war," one said, "it's a business. The CIA moved money through the embassy, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, funding propaganda, paying informants, bribing officers." American planes flew low over the forests, watching Lumumba's movements. Devlin even received a small package from Langley, a vial of poison, meant for Lumumba's food or toothpaste. He never used it, but the message was clear. Washington wanted results. By September, Mobutu made his move. Tanks rolled into Leopoldville. Soldiers took over radio stations. Mobutu appeared on the airwaves in full uniform, announcing a peaceful revolution. He said he was suspending parliament to restore order. Lumumba was placed under house arrest. It was a coup without a shot fired, at least at first. Lumumba's supporters tried to rally, but they were outnumbered. He was no longer the defiant orator of Independence Day. Now, he was a prisoner in his own capital. Still, he refused to yield. He slipped out one night in a convoy, determined to reach Stanleyville in the east, where loyal troops awaited him. For days, he raced through the Congo's heartland, over muddy roads, across rivers, sleeping in the back of a truck. Villagers lined the roads to cheer him on. They called him Tata Lumumba, Father Lumumba. He smiled and waved, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion, but Mobutu's men were closing in. They caught up with him near the Sankuru River. Lumumba, drenched in rain and mud, was dragged from his car. Soldiers tied his hands behind his back, forced him onto a truck, and drove him back to Leopoldville. When the news reached Devlin, he sent a coded cable to Washington. Lumumba captured, situation under control, but nothing was under control. The Congo was splintering further. Soviet advisors were still active in Stanleyville. Katanga had become a fortress of Western interests. And deep within the forests and mines, rebel groups were forming, each one claiming to fight for freedom, but most fighting for power. The Cold War had found its new front line, and Lumumba was about to become its first casualty. The road to Katanga, January 17, 1961, somewhere near Elizabethville, Katanga. The night was moonless, the road a jagged line of mud and gravel cutting through the Congolese bush. A convoy of trucks rumbled slowly forward, headlights dimmed, engines groaning under the weight of their cargo. In the back of one, bound and silent, sat Patrice Lumumba. His wrists were raw from rope, his glasses were gone. His shirt was torn, caked with dirt and blood. On either side of him sat two of his closest allies, Maurice Ampolo and Joseph Okito. They said little. They already knew where the road ended. At the head of the convoy, Belgian officers rode in jeeps, chain-smoking, their faces ghostly in the glow of dashboard lights. Colonel Haig, a Belgian commander, barked orders in clipped French. They had received word from the Katongan government. Lumumba was to be delivered to Mobutu himself. In Elizabethville, the city slept under curfew. The streets were patrolled by Katongan gendarmes and white mercenaries in faded camouflage. Inside a colonial villa at the edge of town, Chom waited, pacing the floor with a cigarette between his fingers. He had told the Belgians he wanted Lumumba alive, but everyone in that room knew what alive meant tonight. As the trucks approached, the rain began to fall. Slow, heavy drops that turned to sheets as the convoy rolled into the compound. Floodlights flickered on, blinding the prisoners as soldiers dragged them from the truck. Lumumba stumbled, nearly fell, then straightened himself. He looked directly at his captors, not with fear, but disgust. "Do what you must," he said quietly in French. "History will judge." They beat him anyway. Rifle butt slammed into his ribs. Boots crushed his fingers. Belgian officers looked away. A Katongan minister laughed. It was an execution masked as an interrogation. At 9:40 p.m., under a flickering light behind the villa, Lumumba and his two companions were taken to a clearing near a grove of trees. A jeep's headlights lit the mud. The firing squad, a Katongan soldiers under Belgian command, lined up. Lumumba stood tall, barefoot, his shirt torn open, the rain washing over his face. He began to speak, but the first shot cut him off, then another, then another. The sound echoed through the forest, swallowed by thunder. When it was done, the bodies were thrown into shallow graves. Later that night, on orders from Brussels, two Belgian officers returned with shovels and acid. They dug up the corpses, hacked them apart, and dissolved what was left in oil drums. There would be no body, no grave, no shrine, only whispers. Back in Leopoldville, Mobutu announced that Lumumba had escaped and been killed by villagers. Few believed it, but no one dared to challenge it. The CIA sent another cable to Washington. Lumumba is dead. No celebration, no regret, just the routine tone of an agent reporting a completed task. But death didn't end his power, it began it. News spread slowly across Africa, through transistor radios and rumors. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah wept in public. In Guinea, crowds filled the streets, chanting Lumumba's name. In Moscow, he was declared a martyr of imperialism. And in Congo, a new wave of rebellion exploded. Lumumba's followers, calling themselves the Lumumbists, took up arms in the east, vowing revenge. The UN, already overwhelmed, struggled to contain the fighting. The CIA had killed a man, but birthed a legend. And as months turned into years, the war for Congo's soul turned bloodier. The Cold War had found its ghost, and his name was Patrice Lumumba. The Shadow War for Congo 1962 to 1965, the Congo Basin. The forest had swallowed the sound of civilization. Helicopters thumped low over the canopy, their rotors scattering flocks of birds into the humid air. Below, rebel fighters barefoot, underfed, armed with rusty rifles, moved through the trees, whispering Lumumba's name as both prayer and battle cry. The Congo was no longer one nation, it was a battlefield carved up by foreign powers and local warlords. In Stanleyville, the Lumumbists declared a people's republic, backed quietly by Soviet weapons and Cuban advisors. In the south, Katanga remained under Western influence, guarded by mercenaries from Belgium, France, and South Africa, men who fought for money, not ideals. Every side claimed to fight for Congo's future. None truly did. The CIA called it Operation Morther. Their goal was to stop the spread of communism in Africa, by any means. They funded loyalist forces under Joseph Mobutu, now promoted to colonel, giving him weapons, vehicles, and cash. Mobutu played both sides when he could, smiling at the Americans while keeping old Belgian officers close. In Washington, Congo was seen as a test case. If Moscow could win hero in the heart of Africa, where uranium for the Hiroshima bomb had been mined, then the West feared the entire continent would turn red. So the US poured in money, intelligence officers, and advisors to the people on the ground. It was chaos. Villages burned, tribal rivalries deepened. Airstrikes by UN planes, flown by Swedish and Indian pilots, tore through rebel camps, killing fighters and civilians alike. In the ruins of Stanleyville, the rebels executed hostages, convinced that the West was orchestrating their destruction, and in a sense, it was. In 1964, a strange coalition formed, a mercenary army led by Mad Mike Hoare, an Irish-born ex-British officer. His men were veterans of colonial wars, dressed in mismatched fatigues, some still wearing berets from the French Foreign Legion. They called themselves Les Offres, the Terrible Ones. They flew into Congo on CIA-supplied planes, landing under fire, and went to work crushing the rebellion. Hoare's men were ruthless. They cleared towns, executed suspected rebels, and drank whiskey at night while counting the day's dead. To Washington, they were heroes. To Congolese families, they were the new colonizers. By late 1965, the war had burned itself out. The Lumumbists were scattered, their leaders dead or exiled. The Soviets pulled back, frustrated by the chaos. The United States had what it wanted, control through Mobutu, a man they now trusted more than anyone else in Africa. That November, Mobutu seized power outright. Tanks once again filled the streets of Leopoldville, which he renamed Kinshasa. He abolished parliament, suspended the constitution, and declared himself president. The Americans didn't just approve, they helped fund the transition. Mobutu promised stability, anti-communism, and open trade. For the next 3 decades, he would rule Congo, renamed Zaire, as a dictator wrapped in leopard skin and gold. Billions in aid and minerals flowed through his regime. His palace grew larger, his people grew poorer. In Washington, he was called a friend of the United States. In Congo, he was known as Le Roi du Zaire, the King of Zaire. Patrice Lumumba's body had vanished, but his spirit lingered. His name became a banner for African independence movements from Angola to South Africa. Streets, schools, and cities were renamed for him. In Moscow, his face appeared on posters beside Marx and Lenin. Even in the Congo, whispers of his legacy refused to die. The Cold War had come and gone, but the scars it left on Congo still bled, in the poverty, the corruption, and the mistrust of foreign hands. Half a century later, the river still flows past Kinshasa, white and brown, carrying with it the memory of a man who believed freedom was not given, it was taken. And for that belief, Patrice Lumumba paid the ultimate price. If you found this story powerful, take a moment to share it. History like this isn't just about the past, it is a mirror for how power still moves in the world today. Subscribe for more untold stories that changed nations and voices that refuse to stay silent.